Henry Lawson, a widower, unexpectedly won $62 million in the lottery, but decided to keep it a secret. Before spending the money, he decided to test his family, pretend he had lost everything in a failed investment, and was facing the risk of losing his house, and asked for a temporary loan of $7,000. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. 6 numbers, I whispered to myself, staring at the blinking digits on the television screen that night. My name is Henry Lawson, and 3 weeks ago I won $62 million in the state lottery. That ticket sat in my trembling hands at this very kitchen table, the overhead bulb buzzing faintly, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence like a drumbeat. My breath caught in my throat. I should have been shouting, running into the street telling the neighbors I was finally free. But instead, a strange calm settled over me, cold and steady as stone. One thing I knew right away, nobody in my family could ever find out. Not Mark, my son, who had called me years ago in the dead of night, begging for just a little more to keep his startup alive. Not Emily, my daughter, who had leaned on me to help her close on her condo, and then drifted away the moment the ink dried. And certainly not Robert, my younger brother, who had spent a lifetime turning guilt into a weapon and turning me into his personal bank. If they knew I held that ticket, they would circle like vultures. Money in this family had never been about love. It had always been about leverage. I pressed the ticket flat against the table, staring at it in disbelief. 62 million. After taxes, maybe 40. More than enough to erase every worry, more than enough to carry me into a future without fear. Yet even in the thrill of victory, a memory surfaced bitter as bile, all the times I had been bled dry in the name of family loyalty. Mark's voice still echoed in my ears. "Dad, it's just $5,000, I'll pay you back soon." He never did. Emily's promises had been softer, but just as empty. "Dad, it's only temporary, I'll make this right once Paul and I catch up." 5 years later, she barely answered my calls. And Robert, he had perfected the art of taking his wheedling tone, always managing to make me feel like the selfish one. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon, ignoring my doctor's warnings about blood pressure. The amber swirl caught the kitchen light, as I thought of all the times I'd played the fool. And worse, all the times I'd needed them and been left alone. When Ellen, my wife, got sick, I nearly drowned under the weight of medical bills. Not one of them showed up with more than excuses. It had been Aunt Martha living on her tiny pension, who had slipped a wrinkled check for $200 into my palm and whispered, "I wish it were more." My own children couldn't spare me a dime, but she had given what little she had without hesitation. That memory lingered as the bourbon burned its way down my throat. If I told my family about the win, I knew exactly what would happen. They would show up with urgent stories, with crises that somehow always required my wallet to solve. Every gift would become an obligation, every favor, another link in the chain around my neck. No, I couldn't tell them. Silence, I realized, was my only protection. I set the glass down with a dull thud and made my decision. I wouldn't just keep the secret, I would test them. Before I spent a single dollar of that fortune, I wanted to know the truth if they thought I was broke. Who would step forward, who would vanish, who would show me their true face. That first night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the ticket, the dull bulb casting lines across the paper. I imagined Ellen's voice soft but steady, reminding me that truth is better than illusion, even if it hurts. Outside, the neighborhood was still. My neighbor, Mr. Harris, walked his dog beneath the flickering street lamp, blissfully unaware that the man waving from the porch could have bought every house on the block. I envied him, envied the simplicity of a life untouched by secrets. But I couldn't turn back. The idea of the test had sunk its claws into me. I remembered the holidays when I'd been nothing but a wallet at the table. I remembered the phone calls that started with, "How are you, Dad?" and ended with, "Can you just—" I remembered Robert's voice warm as syrup when he needed me cold as steel when I didn't comply. And I thought, if I don't find out the truth now, when will I, when I'm on my deathbed wondering if the tears at my funeral are for me or for what I left behind. The next morning I brewed my coffee strong and black just the way I liked it. As the aroma filled the kitchen, I pulled my laptop closer and searched how to claim lottery winnings anonymously. That's when I discovered the idea of a blind trust. An attorney could shield my identity. I could walk away with the money and no one would ever know. My lips curled into a half smile at the thought. Anonymity was worth more than the ticket itself. But even as I planned the practical steps, another thought kept pressing in. Maybe this fortune wasn't about what I could buy, but about what I could learn. For decades, I had carried my family through their storms, quietly never asking for much in return. Now I would turn the tide. I would tell them a story that I'd lost money, that I was close to losing the house, that I needed help. Just $7,000. Not a fortune, not impossible, but enough to test whether love in my family meant more than words. That evening, as the street lamps buzzed to life, I sat on the porch with the slip of paper in my pocket. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, a text from Robert. "Henry, buddy. Can we talk? I'm in a jam." My jaw clenched. The ink wasn't even dry on my miracle, and already the claws were reaching. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, staring into the dark. Inside the house was quiet, the same house where Ellen and I had built a life where laughter had once bounced off these walls. After she passed, silence had become my only companion. And tonight, silence became my ally. It asked for nothing. It demanded no explanations. It didn't disguise need as love. I lit a candle on the table, the flame flickering against the worn wood. I pulled a pad of paper closer and began to write names: Mark, Emily, Robert, Sharon, and Martha. Each one would hear the same story. Each one would have the same chance. My hand trembled as I wrote, not with fear, but with the weight of knowing that this list would reveal more than any fortune could. When I set the pen down, I stared at the flickering flame. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I'll make the first call. The next morning I woke with the decision pressing heavy on my chest. The list of names lay folded in my pocket, the ink still dark from the night before. I poured my coffee, black and bitter, and stared at the steam curling from the mug. I needed to make my next move carefully, not just the calls, but the foundation that would protect me no matter how ugly this got. I opened my laptop and searched again how to claim lottery winnings anonymously. I scrolled past news stories of men and women paraded in front of cameras, giant checks in their hands, smiles plastered across their faces. I knew what came after those pictures, their phones lighting up with calls from friends, cousins, even strangers, all with hands outstretched. No, that would not be me. I found an article about blind trusts. If I hired the right attorney, my name could be hidden, the money placed in a legal shelter. I would walk away invisible. The thought made me exhale for the first time since those numbers lit up the screen. By 9 o'clock, I had written down a number for Heirs and Associates, a law firm downtown. My fingers hovered over the phone, but I forced myself to dial. A receptionist answered briskly, her voice sharp as a tack. "Heirs and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "Yes," I said, lowering my tone. "I need to schedule an appointment with Ms. Linda Myers. It's regarding estate and financial planning." There was a pause. Then, "We have an opening tomorrow morning at 10. Will that work?" "That'll do," I answered, scribbling the address on a notepad. When I hung up, the silence of the house returned, pressing against my ears. My home was modest, peeling paint on the siding, creaking floors that had carried Ellen's laughter and her sickness in equal measure. I hadn't had the heart to move after she died. This was where our story had ended, and I couldn't leave it behind. I stepped onto the porch as dusk approached. Mr. Harris walked his dog down the block, raising a hand in greeting. I waved back, thinking how blissfully unaware he was that the man across the street held a slip of paper that could buy every house on this block. For a moment, I envied him. That night, my phone buzzed on the table. "Robert, Henry Buddy, can we talk? I'm in a jam." I didn't answer. The claws were already reaching, and I hadn't even told him a thing. I turned off the phone, pocketed it, and went inside. The next morning, I pulled on my best jacket, a navy coat with loose buttons that had seen better days, and caught the bus downtown. The office building loomed high, all glass and polished marble, the kind of place that smelled of money. I walked into the lobby, feeling the weight of the envelope in my pocket, the ticket folded and hidden like a lifeline. Linda Myers greeted me with a firm handshake. She was around my age, silver hair swept neatly back, eyes sharp behind thin glasses. She ushered me into her office, and I sat down the chair, sinking too comfortably beneath me. With hands that shook despite my resolve, I laid the ticket on her desk. Her eyebrows lifted for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly, professionalism wrapping around her like armor. "I see," she said softly. "Well, you've come to the right place. We can protect your identity, Mr. Lawson. But first, what do you want this money to do for you?" Her question hung in the air like smoke. What did I want? Security, of course. Freedom, without a doubt. But more than that, I wanted the truth. I wanted to know once and for all whether my family cared for me or only for what I could provide. "I want to keep this quiet," I said finally, "and I want to make sure if I help anyone, it's on my terms." Linda nodded. "Then we'll begin with a blind trust. It'll take a few weeks, but once established, the funds will be untouchable by anyone but you." Relief washed over me, though dread lingered just beneath it. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window as the city blurred past. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered, creased lines, tired eyes. I thought about Linda's question again. "What do you want this money to do for you?" The answer came unbidden. I wanted to strip away the masks. For too long, I had been the dependable one, the man with open hands and a quiet wallet. Every holiday I'd been a guest in my own home, a wallet in a chair. Every phone call had been less about me and more about what I could give. I needed to know if the tables turned, would anyone stand beside me? That night, the idea solidified into a plan. I would tell them I was broke, that I had lost money in bad investments, that I was on the verge of losing the house. I would ask for $7,000, not an impossible sum, but enough to matter. Enough to see who would step forward and who would vanish. I sat at the kitchen table, pen scratching across paper. Mark, Emily, Robert, Sharon, and Martha. As I wrote each name, my chest tightened. Was it cruel to deceive them this way? Perhaps. But after a lifetime of carrying their burdens while they shrugged at mine, I needed to know the truth, no matter how bitter it was. When I finished, I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. I blew out the candle on the table, the flame shivering once before vanishing into smoke. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, the test begins. The paper in my pocket felt heavier than any stone I'd ever carried. That night after the meeting with Linda, I sat back down at the kitchen table, the same scarred surface where I'd eaten dinners alone since Ellen passed, where I'd once spread her hospital bills in shaky stacks, and where the lottery ticket had first glowed under the bulb's dim light. Now that table became the planning ground for a test that could shatter whatever illusions I still clung to about my family. I unfolded the paper and smoothed it flat with my palm. The names looked stark against the white mark. Emily, Robert, Sharon, Martha. I'd written them in careful, deliberate strokes, each letter a reminder of years past, of debts unpaid, of kindnesses remembered. Mark, my son, the one I once believed would carry on the Lawson name with pride. I could still hear the excitement in his voice. That night he called me swearing his new business only needed just $5,000 to take off. I wired him the money before sunrise. Not once did he mention it again. He drove a Tesla, now posted vacation photos from ski resorts. But his father's sacrifices were buried in silence. Emily, my daughter, gentler in her words, sharper in her distance. She'd wanted me at her side when she bought her first condo, leaned on me to cover closing costs when her savings came up short. She'd promised it was temporary. 5 years later, my calls to her phone went unanswered more often than not. Still, I remembered the little girl with her hair in braids, tugging at my hand during county fairs. I wanted to believe there was still some piece of that girl left. Robert, my brother, the master of charm. If there were trophies for borrowed money and broken promises, his shelves would sag beneath the weight. I'd bailed him out after his restaurant folded, after his marriage collapsed, after his gambling debts mounted. Each time he'd leaned on that practiced voice of his, the one that made me feel like refusing would make me less of a brother. But I knew the truth. Robert never saw me as anything more than an ATM with a beating heart. Sharon, his wife. Sharp-tongued judgment, always dripping from her words like acid. At family dinners, she never missed a chance to remind me of the peeling paint on my porch, or the fact that some people just don't get ahead. I'd heard her once tell Ellen within earshot that I was too reliable, as if that were a weakness. For years, I let it slide. This time I wouldn't. And finally, Martha. Dear, frail Martha. My father's sister retired, and living off a pension that barely covered her groceries. When Ellen was sick and I was drowning, it had been Martha who pressed $200 into my palm, her hands trembling. I wish it were more, she'd whispered. That check meant more to me than the thousands my own children had refused. Her name was the only one on the list that didn't fill me with dread. Testing her felt wrong, but fairness demanded it. If I was going to measure my family, I couldn't leave her out. I tapped the pen against the paper, the sound echoing in the silent kitchen. Was it cruel? Maybe. But for once the cruelty wasn't mine. It was theirs, and it had been theirs for years. I had carried them all, lifted them when they stumbled. Filled gaps they refused to bridge themselves. Now I needed to know, when I stumbled, would anyone reach for me? I set the pen down and pulled the worn leather notebook Ellen had once given me from the shelf. She'd bought it at a yard sale, pressed it into my hands with a smile. Write your thoughts down, Henry. Don't carry them all in your chest. I had used it sparingly over the years, jotting down memories of her scraps of poetry she liked. Tonight it would take on a darker purpose. On the first page, in firm, deliberate letters, I wrote, "The Test." Beneath it, I listed each name again, leaving space under each one for their answers. I pressed the pen so hard the ink bled through the paper. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I could already hear their voices. Mark's clipped impatience, Emily's soft excuses, Robert's wheedling, Sharon's scorn, and Martha's gentle willingness no matter how little she had to give. I imagined their reactions, rehearsed their refusals. I braced myself for the bitterness I knew was coming. The house was silent, the only sound the steady tick of the clock on the wall. Once I had thought silence was the cruelest companion a man could have. After Ellen died, it had been unbearable, a weight pressing against my ribs until I thought I would crack. But tonight, silence felt like an ally. It asked for nothing. It didn't disguise need as love. It didn't lie. I reached for the candle on the table, lit the wick, and watched the flame flicker to life. Shadows danced against the walls, stretching long and thin, as if the house itself was leaning in to watch. I placed the notebook in front of me, my hand resting on its cover. Tomorrow, I whispered into the empty kitchen. Tomorrow I make the first call. The flame bent with the draft from the window, then steadied. The house held its breath with me. The next morning I woke before the sun, my chest tight with anticipation and dread. The leather notebook lay on the table where I had left it, the words, "The Test," stamped across the first page in my own hand. Beneath it, the names waited, each one, a wound ready to be reopened. I brewed a pot of coffee black as tar and sat staring at the steam as though it might spell out the future. The phone sat beside me, silent and heavy. My thumb hovered over the screen, scrolling through the names. Mark's was there, bold and glaring, but I couldn't bring myself to start with him. He was my son, and though bitterness had hardened between us, some part of me still hoped he might surprise me. I wasn't ready to lose that hope, not yet. Robert's name stared back, too, but I could already hear his excuses, his practiced sighs. No, I would start softer. Emily, my daughter. She had always been the gentler one, the one who called on holidays, even if out of duty. If anyone could give me a sliver of comfort, a shred of faith, it would be her. I pressed her name, held the phone to my ear, and listened to the rings. 1, 2, 3. Then her voice bright and practiced. "Dad, this is a surprise. Everything okay?" I drew in a slow breath and let weariness bleed into my tone. "Not exactly, Emily. I wouldn't be calling if it weren't important." A pause. Concern, or at least the sound of it, slipped into her voice. "What's wrong?" I let silence stretch long enough for her imagination to fill the gaps. Then carefully I spoke. "The firm I put some savings into collapsed. Fraud, bad management, whatever it was, the money's gone. And the bank's already calling about the mortgage. I need some help. About 7,000. Her sharp intake of breath carried across the line, and for one foolish moment I thought she might surprise me. Then her voice softened, careful and practiced. "Oh, Dad, that's awful. I can't believe they did that to you. But 7,000 is a lot. Paul just paid the kids' school tuition, and we're still catching up on condo renovations. Maybe in a couple of months." I cut in gently, my voice steady. "Emily, the bank won't wait a couple of months. They'll start proceedings within weeks." Her silence stretched too long. I could almost hear her weighing my crisis against her comforts. Finally, she sighed. "I'll talk to Paul. Maybe we can manage a smaller amount. But I can't promise a smaller amount. Half measures delays." I knew that tone. The conversation was already over, and she was eager to hang up before obligation took root. "I understand," I said, flattening my voice. "Of course, Dad," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. "We'll figure something out, don't worry." But I knew she wouldn't figure anything out, not for me. When I ended the call, I set the phone down gently on the table, though my hand trembled. I opened the notebook, drew a line beneath her name, and wrote, "Sympathy. Excuses. No commitment." I stared at the words until the ink blurred. The taste in my mouth was bitter. For a long time I sat, unmoving, my coffee growing cold, the silence pressing against me like a weight. A part of me wanted to stop the experiment right there, to preserve the thin illusion that maybe my family would stand by me if I fell. But illusions are poison. Once you taste the antidote, you can't go back. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. My chest was tight, but my resolve had only deepened. Emily had shown me who she was: not cruel, not heartless, but unwilling to let love cost her more than convenience. And that was enough to mark her answer. The candle flickered on the table, shadows bending across the walls. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I make the next call. I didn't touch the phone again for the rest of the day after Emily. I let her voice linger in the rooms, like a fragrance that was pleasant at first, and then cloying a sweetness that hid the void underneath. Evening pressed its blue weight against the kitchen windows. I washed the coffee cup, dried it, and set it upside down on the rack, the small, ordinary sound of porcelain on metal returning the house to order. Then I blew out the candle and sat in the dark a while, letting my eyes adjust, letting my pulse settle. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I'd make the call that always demanded more steel than I liked to admit. Robert. In our family, my brother's name could summon two very different memories: the boy with grass-stained knees who chased lightning bugs in mason jars, and the man who measured kinship in withdrawals and IOUs. When I finally slept, I dreamed of our father's barn after a summer storm, mud everywhere, a hole torn in the roof. Robert, at 13, laughing and saying, "We'll fix it," Hank then disappearing the moment the hammer came out. I woke to the soft light that comes just before sunrise and the taste of old resentment in my mouth. I brewed the coffee strong and sat down with the leather notebook open to the page where his name waited. Robert. I traced the letters with my forefinger. The pen lay across the spine like a small black baton waiting for me to conduct the next movement. The house was quiet enough to hear the tick-tick-tick of the clock above the stove. Ellen used to tease me for checking that clock whenever a tough conversation was coming. "You do it like you're trying to slow time down," she'd say. Maybe I was. Maybe I still was. I didn't call him at once. I rehearsed. I said the number 7,000 out loud a few times, letting it take on the weight it would need. Not dramatic, not pleading, just specific. Enough to matter, enough to draw a clean line. I stood, paced, sat again. Finally, I pressed his name and lifted the phone to my ear. He answered on the second ring, his voice already smiling. "Henry, brother. I was just thinking about you." "Morning, Robert," I said. I let a rasp of weariness into my tone, and nothing more. "What's new on Paradise Lane?" he asked. I could hear the clink of glass, the scrape of a chair, the theater of casualness. "Not much. I wouldn't be calling if there were any other way." A half-beat of silence. The smile retreated from his voice, replaced by alertness. "Everything okay?" "No," I said. "I made some investments. They went bad. The bank's circling the house. I need 7,000 to cover the gap and keep them off me while I sort it out." There it was. Clean. Plain. The number hung between us. He didn't hesitate long. 7, he said with a soft whistle he wanted me to hear as sympathy but meant as judgment. "Henry, if I had it, you know I would. Times are tight. Clients slow paying. You know how it is. You've said that for 20 years, I replied, and kept my tone even. You also know how it was when the restaurant failed, when the divorce came, when the cards got the better of you. I had it then, and I gave it." He breathed through his nose, an almost laugh, almost sigh. "Yeah, and I've always appreciated that. Family helps family, right? If I could help now, I would. Maybe you should look at refinancing. Sell the truck." "There are ways. Refinancing takes time. The bank isn't waiting. This is the one time I've asked you for anything that matters. Come on, Henry." He shifted registers, that old wheedling tone that had loosened my wallet 1,000 times. "You're the steady one. You always figure it out. You don't need me to swoop in. Besides, 7 is a chunk. You don't want me to put myself in a bind, do you? The old trick make my need an act of cruelty against him." I looked at the notebook and imagined the words I would write. "When do you think you could help, if not now?" Soon, he said brightly, too brightly. Very soon. Let me land a couple invoices. Couple of weeks, Max. You've said couple of weeks for half my life. I let a breath out. I need it now. He paused, then reached for a different mask. Practical man. Then you do what people do, big brother. Sell the place before the bank takes it. Downsize. It's just a house. Just a house. Ellen's laugh, Emma's drawings on the fridge from when she was little, my granddaughter's crooked sons and stick-figure horses, Martha's quiet prayers at our table. That's your answer, I said. That's my reality. He countered a little harder now. You've always been too proud to ask for help. Look at you now, you're asking. That's growth, I'm proud of you. But I'm stretched thin. Family helps family, sure, but I've got my own family to feed. Family helps family? I repeated, tasting the rust on the words. I remember when that meant me helping you. He let the silence swallow that. Then he changed the subject like a man flicking a cigarette out the window. You see the Browns' Sunday Wild fourth quarter. I closed my eyes. That was Robert all over, sanding the edges of the moment until no one could tell the cut had been deep. I've seen enough, I said. I'll let you go. You'll figure it out, he said gently, almost paternally. You always do. We hung up. The kitchen fan hummed. Somewhere down the block, a garbage truck hissed and groaned, men shouting, cans clattering. I set the phone beside the notebook and picked up the pen. Under his name, I wrote in slow, square letters. No money. Deflection. Family helps family used as a shield. Suggests cell house. I put a period after each phrase, a series of small nails to hold the memory in place, when time tried to pry it loose. I stood and rinsed my cup. My hands were steady now. Oddly, the steadiness made room for something else. Fatigue, yes, but also clarity. There is a relief that comes when a sentence you've dreaded finally lands. It still hurts. It will always hurt. But the waiting is over. Ellen once told me that truth hurts less than uncertainty in the long run. You can put a bandage on truth, she'd said. You just keep bleeding under uncertainty. I thought of Robert as a boy of our mother smoothing his hair when he'd sweet-talked his way out of chores of our father, grumbling that charm will carry you farther than fuel. I thought of the first check I wrote him after college, and the last one, and all the ones in between. The checks had their own gravity, each one pulling the next into orbit, each one a quiet denial of what I already knew. I took the notebook to the porch. The air had a thin autumn edge to it, the kind of cool that promised red maples in a week or two. Mr. Harris waved from across the street. I lifted a hand and sat down on the top step, the wood warm under me from the morning sun. I let the neighborhood wash by joggers, a mail truck, a kid in a hoodie chasing a spaniel that wanted exactly the opposite of whatever he wanted it to do. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A text from Robert. Hang in there, brother. You've got this. No offer to follow up. No plan. Just a faux inspirational poster in 12 little words. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Back inside, I poured a second cup and flipped the notebook shut. The weight of it felt earned. Emily's sympathy shaped like a shrug. Robert's shrug draped in a sympathy costume. I would call Mark next, but not yet. I wanted the day to cool. There's a right hour to walk into a hard thing, and this wasn't it. Not for my son. I rinsed the cup again, though it was hardly dirty old habit, a way to reset the room, the moment myself. I walked the rooms the way men sometimes walk, land they're about to sell cataloging what matters in a whisper. In the bedroom, Ellen's old quilt, all those tiny triangles doing the impossible work of making sense from scraps. In the hallway, the framed photo of Martha and me at the county fair, her visor crooked, both of us laughing at nothing. In the living room, the dip in the couch cushion where I'd slept after her funeral, when the bed felt too large to carry my grief. It is not just a house, I thought. It's the ledger of who I've loved. Back at the table, I slid the notebook to the center and sat down before it like a man ready to speak to a judge. I set the pen across the top edge and folded my hands. 2 down, I said aloud to the empty room. 1 more to go today or tomorrow? The clock ticked back like always. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. The temptation to soften the experience rose like a warm tide call. Robert Back let him off the hook, pretend he'd said he'd help, soon paint the refusal as a misunderstanding. For decades, smoothing over had been my instinct. Walter would have told me that was the way a man teaches others how to treat him. You erase the injury, and they learn to strike without consequence. I didn't erase this one. I underlined it in my head. By afternoon, the sun pushed a bright square across the table. I slid the notebook into the drawer and left the kitchen neat as a chapel after service. I put on my jacket and walked to the corner store for milk, nodding to neighbors shaking coins into a palm that didn't shake. On the way back, I counted the cracks in the sidewalk like I used to do with Ellen when the world felt too loud. 1, 2, 3, step. 1, 2, 3, step. By the time I reached the porch, my breathing matched the rhythm. I didn't pour bourbon. Not that day. I wanted the edges sharp. I wanted my memory clean. I wanted every word Robert had said to land with the same weight tomorrow and the next day and 10 years from now. So I made tea. I held the mug and stood at the window as the streetlights winked on 1 by 1, like tired sentries taking their posts. When full dark settled, I opened the drawer, slid the notebook out, and added 1 last line under his name. When pressed, changed the subject to football. Then I closed the book and blew out the thought before it could flare into anger. Anger was hot. It burned out quick. I needed something colder, something that lasted. Tomorrow, I said to the quiet room. Tomorrow, Mark. The clock said nothing back. It only kept time. Morning light slipped through the blinds in pale stripes painting the kitchen table where my leather notebook still lay open. Emily's excuses, Robert's deflections, 2 names already scarred with ink. My hand traced the next one like a man brushing dust from an old tombstone. Mark. My son. I poured coffee and sat down the chair creaking under me. I rehearsed the words as steam curled upward. I made some bad investments. I'm short on the mortgage. I need $7,000. The phrase felt familiar by now, but heavier when I pictured his face. Mark had always been the bold one, eager, restless. When he was 12, he told me he'd be a millionaire by 25. He hadn't been, but that never stopped him from chasing every new scheme that promised to turn nickels into fortunes. And when each scheme collapsed, he always called me. Dad, it's just until the business takes off. I had answered every time. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. I never asked for repayment. I told myself it was what fathers did even when it stung. Now, for the first time in his life, it would be my turn to ask. I stared at the notebook. My chest tightened. Maybe Mark would remember those nights I covered his payroll, those mornings I wired him money before the banks even opened. Maybe I thought there was still something in him that would rise to the moment. The phone felt heavy in my palm as I pressed his number. It rang 4 times before his voice came sharp and impatient. Dad. Everything okay? I'm in the middle of something. I took a steady breath. Not really. I wouldn't be calling if it weren't serious. I made some investments. They collapsed. I'm short on the mortgage. I need $7,000 to hold the bank off. Silence stretched across the line. Then a sharp laugh, humorless. Dad, come on. At your age, gambling on investments, you should have known better. The words landed like stones. I gripped the phone tighter, forcing my voice even. Mark, I planned my whole life. I gave you money when no one else would. I sacrificed for you. I'm asking you now for the first time to help me." His tone hardened. "And I appreciate that. But I can't. I've got payroll to cover a new office lease product launches coming up. You'll figure it out. You always do." The echo of Robert's words, "you always do," stabbed deeper than any refusal. I closed my eyes, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. "I see," I said simply. "Look, Dad," he added briskly. "I'll call you later. Got to run." The line went dead before I could answer. I sat in silence, the phone cooling in my hand. The candle on the table flickered in the draft, its flame bending under the weight of my grief. Slowly, I reached for the notebook, my hand steady, though my heart wasn't. Under Mark's name, I wrote dismissive, lectured me, refused. I set the pen down and leaned back, the ceiling swimming above me. 3 calls, 3 answers, 3 proofs of what I had long suspected but never wanted to face. The walls felt closer now, as though the house itself had absorbed their words. Once this had been Ellen's kitchen, filled with her laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Now it was a courtroom where my family had each taken the stand and testified against themselves. I whispered into the silence, my voice barely audible. So this is what family means. The clock ticked toward midnight, the candle burning, lower shadows stretching long across the floor. Outside, the world carried on, cars rolling down the street, neighbors walking dogs. But in my house, everything had shifted. The experiment was underway, and already it was unraveling more than I was ready to bear. Still, I knew in my bones I couldn't stop now. Tomorrow there would be another name to call, another mask to peel away. And by the time I reached the end of the list, I would know who they were and who I was without them. By morning, I could feel the night's words dried like salt on my skin. Mark's clipped impatience, that laugh turned into a lecture, the refusal tucked neatly inside business terms. I brewed coffee as if the grind and water could scour the taste from my mouth. The leather notebook lay open on the table, 3 names now marked like verdicts: Emily sympathy, no commitment; Robert deflection, sell the house; Mark dismissal, wrapped as advice. The 4th name waited beneath them, a tight little coil of ink that had always made my jaw set: Sharon. If Robert was the velvet glove, Sharon was the brass knuckles. I remembered her leaning in across Thanksgiving gravy boats to comment on the chipped paint on my porch, the way she said, quaint, like it was a diagnosis. I remembered her hand on Ellen's wrist in the doorway, once her smile sharp enough to cut paper. Henry's reliable. Maybe too reliable. People like that never really get ahead. Ellen had squeezed back and let it pass. I had swallowed a stone and called it dinner. I cupped the mug in both hands until the heat bit my palms, then set it down and reached for the phone. I told myself this one wouldn't surprise me. I told myself that expectation made a difference. It didn't. She answered on the 2nd ring, voice crisp all angles. "Henry, what a surprise. Everything all right?" The tone already anticipated a story. "I wish it were," I said. I kept my voice low, frayed at the edges, but steady in the middle. "I wouldn't call if it weren't serious." "Go on," she said, and I could hear a chair slide against tile, the sound of someone settling in for a show. "The investments I made went bad. The bank's circling the house. I need help to hold them off 7,000. There was a pause, long enough to be a calculation. Then came a small, sharp laugh, the kind people use when they test a knife's point with a thumb. 7,000, she repeated, tasting it. Henry, I've always wondered when you'd slip. You've played the saint long enough, helping everyone, acting like you've got the world figured out. Her voice warmed falsely. And now you expect us to bail you out? The words landed like pebbles at first, then stones. I'm not asking for a bailout, I said evenly. I'm asking for help. Family helps family. She made a sound, technically a laugh, spiritually a flinch. Family helps family when it makes sense. We all have responsibilities. Robert and I have our own commitments. It's called living within your means. Like when I helped after the restaurant folded, I asked, still calm. Or when I wrote the check after the hurricane repairs. When I covered 3 months on your mortgage because the contractor vanished, silence widened. Then her tone sharpened. The sugar scorched off. That was different. That was for something we all benefited from. This I could hear the little lift of a shoulder. This is your mess. I let the quiet sit. I imagined her at the granite counter in that big kitchen sunlight on polished chrome, her thumb on the phone screen ready to end the call, and the conversation both tidy and clean. I see, I said finally. Thank you for your honesty. Good luck, she said, and hung up without another word. I kept the phone at my ear a second longer, listening to the dead air. Then I set it down and reached for the notebook. Under her name, I wrote slowly and square scorn. Judgment. No help. I pressed the pen hard enough that the letters impressed the page beneath, as if I worried the ink might fade and memory might try to be merciful. I didn't want mercy. I wanted record. It was still early, the sun a pale coin behind thin clouds, and I found myself pouring bourbon. I watched the amber catch in the glass and set the bottle back with a faint clink I felt in my teeth. The first swallow hit like a reprimand. I didn't want its soft edges, and I wanted them at the same time. I took a second sip and pushed the glass away to the far side of the table, where it sat like a warning bell. 4 calls, 4 different shapes of no Emily with her gauze-wrapped sympathy, Robert with his suggestions designed to save him from any cost, Mark with his brisk lecture about my age, Sharon with the satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting to see the stain spread and was pleased it finally had. I stared at their names and felt the peculiar emptiness that follows both injury and confirmation, like stepping onto a stair you'd always suspected wasn't there, and finding the air exactly where you expected it to be. I stood and walked the length of the room, palm along the wall. A habit from some old winter when the furnace had died, and I'd checked for drafts. In the hallway, the framed photo of Ellen and me caught the light. We were at the lake the year Emily graduated, Ellen's hair in the wind, my arm across her shoulders. I touched the glass, as if there were still warmth there. By mid-morning, the house felt smaller, the ceiling a little lower. The air seemed to carry the echo of their voices, the curve of their refusals. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood had shrugged into the day delivery vans, dogs towing their owners' leaves, skating the curb. Mr. Harris waved, and I waved back. For a moment, the ordinary kindness of that small exchange steadied me better than the bourbon had. I walked to the end of the block, and backhands deep in my pockets. The list of names rattled there like change. Martha's was the one that made me pause at the corner and stare at the traffic light, as if it were deciding for me. Calling her felt like dropping a hook into a shallow pond. You might catch something, but you'd snag the bottom too. She had so little. She had always had so little. And yet when Ellen was sick, she'd pressed $200 into my palm with those bird-bone fingers and whispered that she wished it were more. I sat on the porch steps and watched a blue jay bully a sparrow off the feeder. Not yet, I said, though there was no one to hear. I wasn't ready to test the one person who had passed the test years ago. Fairness demanded it. The ledger insisted, the scientist in me nodded. But the man in me hesitated, protective of the last unbroken place. Back inside, I rinsed the bourbon glass and left it upside down by the sink as if to make a small vow to the afternoon. I poured water instead and drank it in long, sensible swallows. At the table, the notebook waited open like a mouth. I added a line under Sharon's entry I hadn't planned to write, seemed pleased to see me slip. Truth isn't just what is said. It is the expression in the pause between sentences. I moved to the living room and lowered myself into Ellen's old armchair, the one whose cushion kept my shape like a confession. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. I closed my eyes and let the three of them children, brother, sister-in-law stand in a row in my mind. I tried to leave room for the kinder memories. There were some, and they came. Mark asleep on my chest in the hospital when he was new. Emily on a cold morning at the bus stop tucked under my coat. Robert at 8 handing me a pocket knife he'd won at the county fair because he said I needed it more. Then the other images arrived and crowded closed the calls at midnight for just a little. The unchecked boxes where repayment should have been the way sorrow had made me smaller, while their lives stayed busy and bright. By early afternoon, I felt something in me change temperature. Anger is quick. It flashes and burns out. This was something else, colder a clarity that didn't want spectacle. I went to the drawer and took out the small audio recorder Walter had once showed me years ago when he was teaching me to catalog things right. I set it on the table next to the notebook, and for the first time since I started calling, I wished I'd had it running. Proof, Walter would have said. Not to shame them, to anchor you when they tell you later that you remembered it wrong. I ran my thumb along the recorder's edge, then slid it back into the drawer. I would need it soon enough. For now, the ink was enough. The ink and the way the house remembered even when I wanted to forget. I made a sandwich and ate half of it standing up by the sink, then left the rest for the crows who had learned my afternoon routine better than I had. Clouds had thickened. The light went pewter. When the phone rang, once an unknown number, I let it pass to voicemail. A minute later, Robert's name flashed on the screen with a text, checking in. Any luck I didn't answer that either. Luck wasn't what any of this was about. As evening edged in, I turned on the small lamp by the table and watched the circle of light settle on the notebook like a spotlight on a stage. That was when it struck me the house itself had become a kind of theater, the kitchen, the orchestra pit, the living room, the set where these small, brutal scenes played. And if it was a stage, then there would be an act when the curtain rose for more than one of them at once. The thought didn't thrill me. It steadied me. I closed the notebook and laid my palm over its worn cover. I looked at the final name on the list again. Martha. There was no clean way to do this that wouldn't bruise her generosity, and yet the test, to be honest, had to be complete. I let my hand rest where her name was, as if to apologize in advance. Tomorrow, I told the room, the chair, the lamp, the bare boards that had kept more secrets than these. Tomorrow, Martha. The lamp hummed, the refrigerator clicked, the clock on the wall ticked its indifferent ticks. I rinsed the tea mug and shut off the kitchen light. In the dim hallway, the photograph caught what little remained of day. I touched the frame again, then let my hand fall. In bed, I lay awake, listening to the house breathe, the settling, the small creaks that had once spooked me after Ellen died and now sounded like company. 4 calls, 4 answers. One left that mattered in a different way than the rest. I turned to face the dark and felt the cold, steady thing inside me hold. Not hope, not anymore. Something sterner. Something that would not let me lie to myself again. Morning crept in slow gray and damp. The rain had tapped all night against the windows, a steady whisper that made the house feel lonelier than usual. I rose with the heaviness of a man who already knew what the day would demand. The notebook was still on the table, open to the last name. Martha. For years, she'd lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, her pension stretched to the threadbare limit. She clipped coupons, bought dented cans, and wore cardigans with elbows patched in yarn she'd stitched herself. Yet she was the only one who had come through for me when Ellen was sick. She had slipped $200 into my palm cheeks, red with embarrassment, whispering, "I wish it were more." I had held on to that check longer than I held on to any other, cashed it, only when the hospital threatened to withhold a treatment. That memory still burned tender and raw. To test her now felt wrong, like kicking a dog that had never bitten. But fairness demanded I make the call. If I excused her, then the test was incomplete. The truth had to be whole, or it wasn't truth at all. I sipped coffee and stared at her name until the letters blurred. My hand hovered over the phone. Twice I set it down, telling myself I'd call later. Finally, I pressed her number. The line rang longer than I expected, then clicked. Henry. Her voice was thin, but bright like sunlight through lace curtains. "Morning, Martha," I said. I tried to sound casual, but the crack in my voice gave me away. "Everything all right? You don't usually call this early." I swallowed. "Not exactly. I wouldn't be calling if it weren't important. I made some bad investments, lost more than I could afford. The bank's circling the house. I need help. About $7,000. There was no hesitation, not a heartbeat of calculation. Her reply came fast, fierce in its smallness. "Oh, Henry, I don't have that much, but I've got about $3,000 in savings. It's yours. I'll get a cashier's check this afternoon." The words cut me open. I gripped the phone tighter. "Martha, you don't have to nonsense," she said, her voice firm now. "Family helps family. You've helped everyone else all your life. Let me do this for you. I'll manage fine. I'll cut back where I need to. You matter more than a number in a bank." Tears blurred the kitchen into watercolor. I pressed a hand over my eyes, fighting for air. "You'd give me nearly everything you've saved." She chuckled softly, as if the answer were obvious. "What else is it for? I'm not taking it with me. If it buys you peace, it's well spent." I couldn't speak. My throat closed around every word. Finally, I managed. "Thank you, Martha. You don't thank family," she said gently. "You just let them love you when they can." When the call ended, I sat in silence, the phone cooling in my hand. The candle on the table flickered in the draft, its flame trembling like my breath. I opened the notebook and wrote beneath her name, offered nearly all she had. Immediate, no hesitation, pure loyalty. The ink blurred as a tear fell onto the page. For the first time since the test began, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt grief. Yes, grief for what I had lost with the others, but also awe. In a world where my own children had turned me away, where my brother had twisted loyalty into mockery, here was one frail woman on a meager pension ready to empty her savings without a second thought. It wasn't the money. It was the truth. And the truth was, this love exists, but sometimes it comes from the corners we least expect. I closed the notebook and pressed my palm against its cover, as if to seal her answer into my skin. Outside, the rain had stopped, the sky pale and washed clean. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe without the taste of bitterness in my mouth. Tomorrow, I thought, would bring another step. But tonight, I would sit with the knowledge that someone, at least one, had chosen me over money. After Martha's call, the house felt different. The walls didn't press in so tight. The silence wasn't so sharp. I'd sat at that table with my head bowed, her voice still echoing in my chest like a hymn. She had nothing yet, she offered everything. And in doing so, she showed me what love actually looked like when stripped of excuses, conditions, or self-interest. But clarity is a heavy thing. Once you see, you cannot unsee. And I knew the truth about the others would gnaw at me long after Martha's kindness had soothed me. That was when I remembered Walter. Walter had been a friend since Vietnam. We weren't in the same unit, but we met at the VFW hall in town sometime in the 80s. He was the kind of man who saw through walls quiet, scarred with eyes that had measured the world, and decided to stop pretending about it. If there was anyone who would understand what I was doing, it was him. So that evening, I walked down to the VFW hall, the rain-soaked streets shining like oil under the yellow lamps. The flag out front slapped in the damp wind, and inside the air smelled of old wood and spilled beer. Men sat hunched over pool tables, the thud of balls punctuating the low hum of voices. I found Walter at the corner nursing a glass of rye, his white beard stained with tobacco. "Henry," he said, nodding me over. "You've got the look of a man who's been carrying something too heavy alone." I sat down the vinyl seat, sticking to my coat. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out the notebook and set it on the table between us. His eyes flicked to the cover, then back to me. "What's that?" he asked. "My ledger," I said softly. "Not of money, of family." His eyebrows rose, but he didn't laugh. "Go on." I told him everything. About the ticket, the trust, the plan, about Emily's hesitation, Robert's deflections, Mark's lecture, Sharon's cruelty, and finally Martha's grace. I spoke until my throat was dry, and he listened without interruption, his thumb running slow circles on the rim of his glass. When I finished, he leaned back, the chair creaking. "Well," he said, "finally you've done it now." "What do you mean?" I asked. "You've opened your eyes. You can't close them again. That's the curse of truth. You can't go back to believing the lies you lived on before." I stared into my own empty glass. "It hurts more than I thought it would." "Of course it does. You've been carrying a picture of them in your head." "Henry, a picture painted prettier than reality. You needed that picture to keep the holidays warm, to justify the checks, to get through the nights alone. Now that picture's gone. All you've got left is the raw truth." I rubbed my thumb over the edge of the notebook. "So what do I do?" Walter leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You keep records, because when you stop giving, they'll come after you harder than ever. They'll twist words, rewrite history, make you the villain. But if you've got the proof notes recordings, they can't gaslight you out of your own memory." The thought made my stomach twist. "Recordings?" He nodded. "Get yourself a small recorder. Hell, even your phone will do. When you talk to them, hit record. Keep it all. One day when they try to say you remembered it wrong, you'll have the truth in their own voices." I sat back, the idea settling like a weight. Proof. Hard evidence. I hadn't thought of that, but now I knew he was right. Walter raised his glass in a small toast. "Martha's the only one who passed your test because she was already the only one who didn't need to be tested. Hold on to that. Don't let the others tear it away from you." We sat in silence for a while, the pool balls clattering in the background, the jukebox humming low. When I finally stood to leave, Walter clapped a hand on my shoulder, heavy and steady. "You're not crazy for doing this, Henry. You're just tired of being blind, and tired men deserve the truth." Walking home through the damp night, I felt the recorder-shaped absence in my pocket. Tomorrow I decided I'd fill that space. Tomorrow I'd be ready. When I got back, I opened the notebook and wrote one more line under Martha's name, "Love costs," and she paid without counting. Then I turned the page and wrote at the top, in bold letters, "From now on, document everything." The candle burned low, the flame bending as if bowing to the words on the page. The morning after my talk with Walter, I walked into a small electronics store on Main Street. The place smelled of dust and plastic shelves, lined with radios, phone cases, and chargers in faded packaging. A young clerk in a red polo barely looked up from his phone when I asked about recorders. "Over there, bottom shelf," he said, waving toward the far corner. I crouched, knees popping, and found a row of digital voice recorders, sleek and unassuming. I picked the smallest one, no bigger than a deck of cards, with a simple red button that promised it would start recording without fuss. I paid cash and walked out with the box tucked under my arm like a secret. Back at the kitchen table, I tore open the packaging, slid in the batteries, and pressed the button. A small red light glowed steady. I spoke into it, softly testing. This is Henry Lawson beginning a record of conversations. My own voice came back, tinny but clear. Proof, I thought. Walter was right. If I was going to drag truth into the open, I needed more than my own memory. That afternoon, I decided to widen the test. My children and brother had already shown me where they stood, but there were others' relatives who'd leaned on me over the years when times were hard. Cousin Harold, who once borrowed $3,000 to cover medical bills and never repaid a dime. Niece Kelly, who had smiled sweetly when I helped with her tuition, only to vanish afterward. If they believed I was broke, what would they do now? I set the recorder beside the phone, pressed the red button, and dialed Harold. He answered with his usual bluster. Henry Longtime. What's going on? I took a breath. Harold, I wouldn't be calling if it weren't serious. I made some bad investments, the bank's circling the house. I need about $7,000 to hold them off. There was a beat of silence. Then he chuckled, but it wasn't kind. Henry, you know if I had it, I'd help. But business has been rough. I'm barely keeping afloat myself. You'll figure something out. You always do. The words struck like déjà vu, Mark Robert Harold, all singing the same refrain. I kept my voice calm. So you can't help at all, wish I could, cousin. Really do, but not a chance right now. Call me when things turn around, eh? He hung up before I could answer. I picked up the recorder, pressed stop, and stared at the glowing red light as it faded. Next, Kelly. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright. Uncle Henry, how are you? I've been better, I said, repeating the story. I'm short on the mortgage. Need about $7,000. Her tone softened instantly, almost rehearsed. Oh no, that's terrible, but I really can't right now. Student loans, car payments, you know how it is. Maybe in a year or so. A year won't help me, I said evenly. Then I don't know what to say, she replied quickly. I'll pray for you, Uncle. And just like that, she was gone. I sat back, the phone cooling in my hand, the recorder still blinking. My stomach twisted, but my chest felt steady. This time there was no sting, no shock, only clarity. I pressed stop and wrote their names in the notebook. Harold laughed, refused. Kelly's sympathy excuses no help. I closed the cover and let out a slow breath. With every call, the illusions thinned. I could see them now without the paint I'd brushed over their faces for years. They weren't villains, not really. Just selfish. Just unwilling to let love cost them more than words. As the sun dipped low, I carried the recorder to the porch and sat with it in my palm. Walter had been right. Once the truth is spoken, you can't unhear it. And with their voices captured, there was no erasing, no rewriting. Inside the house glowed with the soft light of evening. I set the recorder beside the candle on the table, its red light winking like a second flame. Then I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote across the top, "The mask is gone." I leaned back in the chair, the silence filling in around me like water around a stone. For the first time, I didn't feel crushed by it. I felt carried. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I'll press further. I spent the night listening to the house breathe pipes, tick wood, settle the old clock clearing its throat every quarter hour. Martha's voice still lingered in the air like a hymn. You don't thank family. You just let them love you when they can. It should have soothed me all the way to sleep. Instead, it sharpened what came next. By morning, I'd decided to push the test further. It wasn't enough to know who would write a check. I needed to see who would stand close when I looked like I was failing for real. Not a temporary dip. Collapse. People show their truest selves when something valuable looks like it's slipping out of reach. I set the recorder on the table and pressed the red button. The little light blinked steady, a heartbeat I could see. I scrolled to Mark's name and hesitated. There's a particular pain in asking your own child whether there's room for you in his life that doesn't involve a routing number. Still, I'd chosen truth over comfort. I dialed. He answered on the fourth ring, breathless, like I'd caught him mid-stride. "Dad, Mark," I said, letting a tremor hitch the first syllable the way old stairs creak when you put weight on them. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The bank called again. They said foreclosure papers might come next week. Silence then, the sound of him clearing his throat. "That's rough. What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I said, and I let the words hang a little the way a man might when he's too tired to hold them up. "Maybe I just let them take it. Maybe that's easier." Something brightened in his voice. Relief dressed up as problem-solving. "Well, if you lose the house, you can always move into assisted living. Sophie's mom found a good place for her aunt. Payment plans, medical staff, structured meals, safer, assisted living." He was already moving me into a brochure. I pinched the bridge of my nose and kept my voice level. "I see. It might be best he went on gathering momentum. You'd be around people your age. No more stress with upkeep. Honestly, Dad, it could be a win-win." A win-win. For whom I pictured him in his glass office pointing at the ceiling while he explained to a junior partner how he'd solved the old man problem with a tidy line item. "Thank you," I said. "You've given me a lot to think about." "Okay," he said, and then almost cheerfully, "Keep me posted." We hung up. The red light blinked. Proof. I picked up the notebook and wrote under his name, "Offered assisted living." Eager relief in tone. Win-win. I pressed so hard the tip of the pen almost tore the paper. I sat a long time with the recorder in my palm, feeling its small mechanical pulse and the bigger, colder pulse gathering in my chest. I didn't pour bourbon. I wanted the edges sharp. When the afternoon thinned to gray, I scrolled to Emily. Calling her felt like opening a door I already knew led to a hallway with no lights. Still, I pressed the button, clicked the recorder on again, and lifted the phone. She picked up on the third ring, her voice careful, a little breathless. "Dad." "Is everything okay?" "It's late," I said, and let the rasp in. "I don't think I can cover the mortgage this month. I might be out on the street." A pause. Not concern calculation. I could hear the gears in her mind tallying up square footage, kids' bed schedules, excuses the way a person counts luggage before a trip they don't want to take. "If that happens, Dad," she said finally, "you can always sell the house and move in with someone. Maybe Uncle Robert has space. Or those retirement communities aren't so bad." "Would you take me in?" I asked quietly. No embroidery, no soft landing, just the question sitting there like a stone in a still pond. The silence stretched so long the recorder captured the sound of my own breathing. When she spoke, her voice was thin, the words pre-wrinkled by apology. "Dad, you know it's complicated. The kids, the space, you'd be uncomfortable. I wouldn't want to burden you," I said. The truth was a taste in my mouth I'd been trying not to name for years. "That's not what I meant," she rushed. Just let me talk to Paul. We'll figure something out." I could hear the eagerness to end the call the way a horse feels the barn at the end of a long ride. "Thank you for listening," I said, and thumbed the call away. In the notebook I wrote, "Couldn't say yes, offered retirement village," suggested Robert. Silence louder than refusal. I set the pen down. For a long time I watched the tiny red light blink on the recorder, as steady and indifferent as a metronome. Then I pressed stop. The kitchen felt larger, as if the room had exhaled, and wasn't sure yet if it should inhale again. It surprised me that I didn't feel rage. Hurt, yes. But somewhere inside the hurt, there was a strange kind of loosening, like a knot giving way. Walter's words from the VFW echoed back. Once you see who they are, you can't unsee it. I realized with a kind of calm that the seeing was also a kind of freedom. When you stop asking a person for something they've never planned to give, a peculiar weight lifts off your chest. The phone buzzed on the table, a text from Mark. Sending you a link to a great facility. They have a shuttle to church. A minute later, one from Emily. Paul says it might be best to sell before it gets ugly. Love you. I didn't reply. I didn't trust what would come out of my thumbs. I stepped outside. Evening had pulled a slate lid over the neighborhood. Somewhere a grill hissed. Someone laughed in the same key I remembered Ellen laughing in when I burned tilapia, and she pretended to like it anyway. I walked to the sidewalk and back, palms deep in my pockets, feeling for something I couldn't name. By the time I re-entered the kitchen, I knew. I wasn't done. The phone rang once, and I let it then twice, and I picked up. Walter, you called them? He said. Not a question. I did. He breathed out through his nose, a sound like an old radiator letting off steam. They fail you again? Yes. Good. I almost laughed. Good. Good, he said, flat and certain. Because the more they fail, the more you're freed from the leash. You think you're losing family, Henry. What you're losing is the choke chain they've had on your neck for decades. I thought of the holidays at my table, me seated like a wallet in a chair. The late-night calls that started with, "How are you, Dad?" and ended with routing numbers. I thought of Ellen in her nightgown, standing in the doorway, the soft shake of her head that meant, "You don't owe them this," and the softer smile that meant, "I know you'll do it anyway." The leash had been woven from 1,000 small choices to make peace by paying for it. Walter was right. They weren't taking anything from me that didn't need to go. I want to see how close they'll come, I said. If they think I'm drowning, really drowning, do they throw a line, or do they start measuring the furniture? Let them think they're winning, Walter said. Don't rush. Don't tip your hand. The closer they get, the clearer the picture. We hung up. I stood with my hand on the phone for a while, listening to the house settle around me. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do that night. I gathered the stack of fake past due notices. I'd printed the ones I'd left face up on the counter and fanned them out like a dealer laying down cards. I set an unpaid utility bill on top for good measure. The place looked like a slow-motion shipwreck. If anyone dropped by, I wanted them to see the water rising. It didn't take long. At 8:17 p.m., headlights rolled across my living room wall and then snapped dark. A knock, brisk and practiced, landed on the door. I pocketed the recorder, pressed the red eye to life, and opened up. Robert stood on the step in a leather jacket that still smelled like the store. He wore the smile of a man who believed he'd brought you something you were lucky to receive. Henry, he said, voice syrupy. Heard things are rough. Thought I'd swing by. I stepped back and let him in. He looked around the kitchen like a contractor assessing storm damage. His gaze paused on the scatter of envelopes, the unpaid stamp glaring like a rash. He clucked his tongue in a performance of concern I'd seen before in other acts. You know, he said, settling into a chair, I've been thinking. Before the bank embarrasses you. I could take this place off your hands. Cash. Tomorrow. Clean and easy. Get you something to tide you over. He slid a folded envelope across the table. Offer letter. All legal. His grin showed a lot of teeth. I'm doing this for you, Henry. I didn't touch it. The recorder hummed in my pocket. For me, I repeated. Of course, he said quickly. We're brothers. I let the silence stretch until even the refrigerator seemed to hold its breath. Then I looked at the envelope and back at his face and said very gently, "Let's talk tomorrow." He blinked, surprised by how easy that had been, and stood clapping my shoulder like we were still boys. "Smart man. Sleep on it." He left whistling the picture of a hero who'd rescued a stranger from a fire he'd set himself. When the door clicked shut, I pulled the recorder from my pocket and pressed stop. The room felt different, charged as if I'd rubbed a balloon against the ribs of the house and left it buzzing. I opened my notebook and wrote the words, slowly savoring each letter Robert predatory offer. For me, I didn't sleep much. Not from worry, from resolve. The house was a stage now. The props were in place, past due notices, a tired man, a family's practiced lines. Tomorrow the curtain would lift higher. I felt the cold, steady thing inside me settle its weight and sit up straight. Closer, I told the quiet room. Come closer. The next morning I found myself staring at the folded envelope Robert had left on the table. His offer. Cash clean, easy. His words echoed in my ears. I hadn't opened it. Didn't need to. I already knew what it contained, a number insultingly low, dressed up as generosity. He wasn't here to save me. He was here to take the house before the bank could. I set the envelope aside and reached for the recorder, running my thumb over its edge. Walter's voice drifted back to me. Don't rush. Don't tip your hand. The closer they get, the clearer the picture. By noon, the phone rang. Mark this time. His voice carried a strange brightness, like he'd been rehearsing. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation. If the house is really too much, maybe it's time we step in. Emily and I talked. We could help manage the sale, make sure you get something before foreclosure takes it all. Step in. Manage the sale. I almost laughed. So you'd handle everything I asked, keeping my voice tired. Exactly, he said quickly. You wouldn't have to stress about paperwork. We'll line up a realtor, maybe even buy it ourselves. That way it stays in the family. Stays in the family. The phrase carried the oily weight of possession, not care. I murmured something non-committal, let him talk a while longer, then ended the call. The recorder blinked its quiet red light the whole time. Not an hour later, Emily called. Her voice was softer, laced with concern, but underlined with calculation. Dad, Paul, and I hate to see you struggle. If it helps, we could take over the property. You'd get some cash and we'd keep it in good shape. You could even stay a while until you're settled somewhere else. Stay a while. Like a guest in my own home. I let the silence drag until she stumbled into reassurance. It's just an idea. We're only thinking of you. I ended the call, pressed stop on the recorder, and opened the notebook. Under Mark wants to manage sale. Talks of keeping house in family. Under Emily offered takeover. Guest in own home. The words filled the page like verdicts. For years I'd wondered if my children saw me, or only what I could give them. Now I knew. And knowing carried its own weight, both heavy and freeing. That evening, Robert returned, swaggering through the door like a man with victory in his pocket. Thought about my offer, he asked, dropping into the chair without waiting for permission. I have, I said. And his grin widened. Let's talk tomorrow. I repeated the same phrase I'd used before. I let him think he'd won, let him hum with satisfaction as he stood and clapped me on the back. When he left, the house seemed to sigh with relief. I pulled the recorder from my pocket and played back his oily voice, his rehearsed concern, his casual greed. Proof. Not just for me for the moment when the lies began, when they insisted I remembered wrong. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on its worn cover. The pages now carried more than names, they carried the map of my family's soul. What had once been blurred by hope was now sketched in black ink, sharp and undeniable. Tomorrow, I thought, would bring the moment to strip away the last masks. They thought I was drowning. They thought they were circling for scraps. but tomorrow I would turn the tide. The candle burned low, the recorder sat heavy in my palm, and I whispered into the silence. The curtain's about to rise. The house was unnervingly quiet that morning, as though it knew what was coming. I brewed coffee I didn't drink, set the leather notebook at the center of the table, and placed the recorder beside it. For days I had collected their words like specimens in a jar. Now it was time to hold them up to the light. I didn't need to call. By mid-morning, the knock came sharp and hurried. When I opened the door, Robert stood there with his envelope, Mark with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder, and Emily clutching a folder against her chest. They filed in like lawyers arriving for deposition, all smiles stretched too wide. Robert clapped his hands together. "All right, Henry, let's get this settled before the bank embarrasses you." Mark set his laptop on the table screen, glowing. "I've already run numbers, Dad. If we sell quickly, we can salvage equity. Emily and I are ready to move fast." Emily added softly, "This is for your own good. You'll thank us later." I watched them circle the kitchen, the same kitchen where Ellen once served pie and laughter, where birthdays had been sung, where Martha had pressed that small check into my hand with tears in her eyes. Now it felt like a marketplace, and I was the product. Robert slid the envelope across the table again. "Here's the offer. Cash. No waiting. We keep it in the family." Mark leaned forward. "Or Emily and I could buy it ourselves. That way you'd still be connected. You wouldn't lose everything." Emily's voice faltered, but she pressed on. "We'll make sure you're comfortable, Dad. You can stay for a while until you're ready to move into something smaller." Their words overlapped a chorus of urgency, each one trying to outbid the other, not for me, but for the house. I let the noise swell, let their eagerness expose itself in sharper tones. Then, slowly, I reached into my pocket and set the recorder on the table. The red light blinked steady like a tiny heartbeat. The room fell silent. "What's that?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "A recorder," I said. My tone was calm, almost gentle. "It's been running for days. Every call, every word." Emily's face drained of color. "Dad, why would you?" Robert tried to laugh, but it cracked in the middle. "That's unnecessary, Henry. We're just trying to help." I slid the notebook open, pages filled with ink. "Help," I repeated. "Emily sympathy excuses no money. Robert, predatory offer, told me to sell. Mark lectures suggested assisted living." Sharon mocked me. "And today all three of you here not to ask how I am, but to argue over this house like vultures picking at a carcass." The silence that followed was deeper than any storm. Mark's jaw worked, but no words came. Emily blinked fast, her hands clutching the folder until the paper bent. Robert shifted in his chair, the swagger drained from him. "You think I'm a fool?" I said softly. "You always have. You thought I'd keep giving until there was nothing left. But this time I asked for help, and not one of you stood up." Mark muttered. "It wasn't like that, it was exactly like that." I cut in my voice, sharp now. "And I have the proof." I tapped the recorder. Every word, every excuse, every offer dressed as kindness. You can't twist it. You can't tell me later I remembered wrong. Emily's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Robert opened his mouth, closed it, then shrugged as though the game had ended, and the prize had slipped away. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "You've shown me who you are, and I won't forget it." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Robert stood, shoving the envelope back into his pocket. "Fine," he muttered. "If you want to wallow in pride, that's on you." Mark gathered his laptop in silence. Emily lingered a second longer, her lips trembling as if she might speak, but in the end, she only turned and followed the others out. When the door closed, the house exhaled. I sat alone at the table, the notebook open before me, the recorder still blinking red. Proof. Not for them, for me. Proof that the illusions I had carried for years were gone, replaced by something harsher, but cleaner truth. I pressed, Stop leaned back, and whispered to the empty room. The masks are gone. The candle flame shivered, steadying again, as though the house itself approved. When the door finally latched behind them, the house went very still, as if the walls had been holding their own breath through the entire performance and could finally exhale. I sat at the table with the recorder between my hands, the little red eye gone dark now, the leather notebook open like a ledger at the end of a long audit. For a while, I didn't move. I just listened to the ticking clock and the faint hiss of the refrigerator and let the truth I'd forced into daylight settle where it belonged. I slid the notebook aside and pulled open the drawer that held the envelope, my real one. Not Robert's insult disguised as a lifeline, but the thin paper sleeve with 6 numbers that had upended my life. I laid it on the table and rested my palm on it as if I could measure its weight. Funny thing about paper, it feels like nothing until you understand what's written on it. Then it weighs more than a house. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. Money doesn't change people. It shows them. Tonight my family had stood in my kitchen and shown me exactly who they were when they thought I was powerless. That wasn't a loss. It wasn't a victory either. It was a revelation. And revelations aren't for celebrating, they're for living with. I slipped the ticket back into the sleeve and the sleeve back into the drawer. The decision I had made on the first night held fast. I would keep the win to myself. Not as a punishment, not as a secret meant to humiliate anyone later, but as a shelter for my peace. Silence had protected me this far. I wasn't about to trade it for applause I didn't need or approval I could no longer afford. The next morning I dressed carefully the way I used to on the first day of a new job. I called Linda Myers and asked for a follow-up. In her office, sunlight showed dust turning slowly in the air, and the city hummed through the window as if it had never paused for anyone's private earthquake. Linda listened professional as ever as I outlined my final instructions. We finalized the blind trust. We added a clause that made my anonymity tighter than bark on a tree. We set up a trustee structure that didn't include a single family member. Then I asked for 3 more things. First, a monthly stipend. No call it a quiet pension to be routed to Aunt Martha through an intermediary, so it would never feel like charity. She'd never accept a flashy gift, but she'd accept dignity. Second, a small scholarship fund in Ellen's name at the local elementary school book supplies field trips for kids whose backpacks were heavier with worry than with paper. Third, a note in my will that left the house to me for as long as I cared to live in it, and if I chose to sell it, the proceeds would flow to the fund. The house could stop being a prize. It could go back to being what it really was, shelter and memory. Linda's pen moved neat and efficient. Anything else? Yes, I said. If I get sick, if I'm ever not thinking straight, I want the same anonymity. No announcements, no family councils. My decisions stay mine. She looked up, eyes kind over the rims of her glasses. Understood. When I got home, the sun had tilted west, laying a warm stripe across the table. I took the predatory offer Robert had left and read it for the first time. The number was as obscene as I'd imagined. I folded the page once, twice, and slid it into the metal coffee can Walter and I used to burn leaves. Out on the porch, I struck a match. The paper curled, darkened, and lifted in a quiet bloom of ash that the breeze carried toward the maples. That felt right. Let trees feed on the lie and turn it into something green. I called Walter, told him it was done. He came over with his thermos of coffee and sat beside me on the steps. We didn't say much. He didn't need a play-by-play. He'd already seen the film in my eyes. When I did speak, it was only to say, "You were right about the leash." He nodded at the blackened flecks drifting in the air. "Hard to breathe with one on. You'll get used to the air again." Inside, I dialed Martha. She answered on the second ring, breath warm as bread. "Henriette, I figured things out," I said. "I'm okay." "Good," she said, and I could hear the smile. "Your voice sounds lighter." "It is." I cleared my throat. "About your offer, you keep your savings." "Please." "Stubborn," she teased. "Fine." "Then let me buy you lunch." "Deal," I said, and we set a date for the diner. She likes the one that smells like cinnamon after 10 in the morning and overcooked bacon before. When I hung up, I sat a while and let the promise of something simple and kind fill the rooms, a noon table coffee poured without asking her small hand patting mine. For Mark and Emily, I wrote letters I didn't send. Not yet. I said the things that needed saying without the heat of a kitchen argument. I told them I loved them and that I wouldn't be discussing my finances again. I told them the house would not be signed over sold under pressure or used as an oxygen mask for their anxiety. I told them visits were welcome. Money requests were not. If they wanted a father, they had one. If they wanted a wallet, they should call the bank. I sealed the letters and set them in the drawer, with the ticket side by side, 3 thin envelopes that together felt heavier than a safe. That night I cooked a small supper, eggs and toast, simple as a promise I could keep. I ate at the table where Ellen once set out Sunday roasts and birthday cakes, where my family had just unmasked themselves, where my new life sat scribbled in a notebook. I washed the plate, dried it, and put it away. The day had been full, the kind that ends with a tiredness you can trust. Before bed, I flipped open the notebook to the very last page and wrote one final line beneath the others. Not a name this time. Not a verdict. Just a vow I choose quiet over chaos, truth over approval, and love that costs something over love that only speaks. I closed the book and slid it onto the shelf. The house hummed its old, faithful song. I turned out the light and listened to the dark breathe. No texts chimed. No knocks came. Somewhere a freight train pulled its long sorrow through town and kept going. I lay awake a little while. Then I didn't. It took me most of a lifetime to understand that money is a mirror and a microphone. It shows you who people already are, and it turns up the volume on their truest songs. When I looked broke, some folks sang sorrow with a price tag. One woman sang love without counting. If you're listening closely, you'll hear the difference. And here's what I learned when the masks fell. Boundaries are not walls to keep love out. They're doors to let real love in. Real love doesn't invoice you. It shows up at inconvenient hours. It doesn't bargain for your dignity. It guards it. If you're standing where I stood, gauging the weight of your silence, wondering who would lean in if you faltered, write it down. Keep a record for your own sanity. Stop apologizing for needing proof. Then choose peace on purpose. Protect your name, your roof, your sleep. And when you find your Martha, the person who offers what they can without a ledger, hold them close and honor them while they can still hear it. The rest, bless them and step back. You can love people and limit their access at the same time. If this story hit home, tell me what part rang true for you in the comments. Did you ever discover who stood by you when it actually cost them something? I read what you write, and I learn from it. And if you want more stories about hard-won truth, quiet courage, and the kind of love that endures, subscribe and stick around. We'll keep the light on at the table.